Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So wonderful to be here with all of you. Such beautiful music and the meditation, such a wonderful feeling of openness and warmth here with all of you. And so I'm so grateful to be talking on this subject of honoring the sacred. So in my talk, I'll be exploring what is sacred and how do we honor that in our own lives, in our relationships, and with the world. And so, of course, I'll be sharing from my own perspective, but I know that each one of us is on our own unique journey of discovering what is sacred to us and how to honor that in our lives. And so I will be exploring the issue of what can we know from within ourselves and share that with the world, as so has been so beautifully expressed here in the meditation and in the music. And so what I know to be true is that all life is sacred. From our formless essence to the galaxies, the billions of stars, this earth, the animals, to each one of us. And this was shown to me, revealed to me, in what some might call a mystical experience. And I'm sure that many of you have had that deep knowing of the truth of this, of the essential unity of life. And so I know this to be true beyond a shadow of a doubt. Our transcendent nature is beyond description. There's a beautiful quote from Taoism. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. In other words, the truth that can be spoken is not the eternal truth. And this just points to the fact that who we are in our essence really is beyond definition, beyond description, by any word or any concept. It's such a mystery. Our immanent form here in nature, in our bodies, in our lives, in the world, is also sacred. It is the manifestation of this divine essence in form here in each one of us and in the world. And it really is only our conditioning that can convince us otherwise. But our conditioning is so strong, as we all know. I mean, we're really living in a world that, unfortunately, for the most part, has forgotten this essential truth of the unity of life and the sacredness of all life. And our Western culture has become so materialistic, so consumed with materialism, consumerism, and acquiring more stuff, that the soul, the life of the soul, has all but been drowned out, except for those of us who, fortunately, are being awakened more and more to this truth of our eternal being. And so while preparing this talk, I remembered some things that I hadn't thought about in decades, really. And it was surprising to remember that growing up in the 1950s and even into the 1960s, stores were closed on Sundays. I couldn't believe, just even remembering the truth of that that's how it used to be. And I'm assuming it was so all across the country and maybe in different places in the world. Stores were closed on Sundays. And so, I was raised Catholic, so of course we had to go to church. And so a lot of the neighborhood would go to church on Sundays. And I remember our families would get together afterwards, and the parents would visit and have coffee together, and the kids would play together. I mean, it really was a day that was set aside in our culture to honor the sacred, not that long ago. And of course now stores are open on Sundays. Many of them are open 24 hours a day. I mean, it's becoming a challenge, really, to just not have the stores even open now on Christmas, and I think even some of them are starting to do that. So it just goes to show the transitions we've seen even in our culture, just in some of our lifetimes, of how the way of honoring the sacred is just not as prevalent as it used to be in our culture. And so another one of the drastic changes, of course, has been this technology explosion. I mean, now you can pretty much be plugged in to some sort of technological device from the minute you wake up in the morning till when you go to bed at night. It's like it's hard to get away from it. And so it's some people really are becoming addicted to the technology. That may not be as much true of those of us in this room here today, but more and more folks are finding that it's starting to take over their life between email and cell phones and smartphones and all the rest of it. We're also really living in an information age where we're just bombarded with so much information from so many different directions. And we get the feeling that anything that we need to know, we can find on Google, right? We can just jump on Google and it'll answer it for us. And you may get onto Google and think that you're just going to spend a few minutes doing some research, right? And then 2 hours later, you wake up from the internet-induced trance and wonder where in the world you've been. You've seen cats playing, you've heard dogs singing, and everything in between, right? It's like, where did I go? So, and then also we could say there's been an entertainment explosion. Back from the early days when television first showed up on the scene, where we had like 3 channels to choose from, and now there are hundreds of channels, and on 24 hours a day, and everything you can think of on the TV. And so, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I wish we could go back to the past, because for me, life is all about really accepting reality as it is. Otherwise, we're just arguing with reality and suffering. So that's not why I'm bringing this up. I'm really bringing it up just to point to the fact that I think it's important that we're conscious of the influence of our culture and how we can really just be swept away in the current of the materialism and all of these, you could say wonderful activities in the outer world that can pull us endlessly outside into the world. And some people are actually really looking for their fulfillment in all of those things, which of course is ultimately frustrating and ultimately not fulfilling. And so that's the reason I'm bringing it up, is just the importance of seeing that these things really can become a distraction from who we really are and what is really most valuable. And our culture is also very outer focused, very extroverted. It's all about doing, and there's very little encouragement to go within and to discover our inner being and the peace and love and fulfillment that we can find there, that we don't find really ultimately in the outer world. And also, it's very much about intellectual knowledge. There's very little value given to inner knowing, to intuitive understanding. And so we have to somehow learn to value that within ourselves, even though that isn't the message that our culture gives us. There's a couple of beautiful quotes that I'd love to share with you along these lines, about this whole issue of how we don't value intuition, and how we are very much taught to be in our heads and not in our hearts. And so it's just so important, and it's not the message we get in our culture. So the Sufi teacher, Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, whom I had the pleasure of meeting at a conference a few months ago, in his book, The Return of the Feminine and the World's Soul, he said, "Our masculine culture has focused on an external, definable, and measurable world, but the feminine knows a different dimension. The language of our rational culture is ill-equipped to describe the inner realms of the mystic, shaman, and seer." And also, Albert Einstein had something to say along these lines. He said, "I did not arrive at my understanding of the fundamental laws of the universe through my rational mind. He also said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, the rational mind a loyal servant. Our society has honored the servant and forgotten the gift. So I just find that so amazing that came from Albert Einstein, who is known, most people think of him for his brilliant intellect. And here he is saying that isn't really how he found what he knew. And also when you think of it, that he would have said this probably easily 50 years ago, and how, the changes that have happened since his lifetime. So how do we honor the sacred within ourselves? We can make it a priority to care for our souls. We do have a soul, and we're not taught so much about how to care for it, but it does need our love and attention and care. And so, we may really feel like we're going against the current of the culture. So it takes a real commitment, because really we are going against the current of the culture in these times, to honor the soul and to tend to it. And so I love the image of the salmon. Have you ever seen that? I've seen it on TV, with the salmon swimming against the current on its journey home, and sometimes literally flying up out of the water. It's just so touching and so poignant, really, to this what it can feel like on pushing against the current on our journey home. So I think the salmon is just such a beautiful metaphor in that sense. And really at a certain point in our journey, I think it's very important to have a spiritual practice, to discover what it is that helps you to really feel the presence of your inner being, God, Goddess, all that is, whatever word you use, that the name that you give to this nameless essence that we are. How do you tap into that place within? But having a spiritual practice and a spiritual discipline that you really are serious about is where the rubber meets the road in this process of our commitment to ourselves. I was introduced to the path of yoga by my first spiritual teacher over 30 years ago, and of course meditation is part of that path. And I found that meditation is such a wonderful gift in this process of helping us to settle our minds and feel our hearts. And so meditation I highly recommend if you haven't explored that. And at first my mind was as noisy as everyone else's mind. And that's one of the frustrations that people tend to feel, is they sit down and they're wanting silence, and all they get is the noise of all their thoughts, the busyness of thinking what they should be doing instead of sitting there and in silence. And so really it takes practice. And there's a wonderful story that I like to tell about a Zen teacher and his student in this process. It points to this thing that I'm talking about here, which is, they were together in nature, and the point was to be together in silence. And so at first they were walking and enjoying the beauty of nature, and then they were sitting, sharing a simple meal together. And of course, the student's mind was filled with thoughts, filled with questions, and he was very frustrated. It was so hard to keep the silence. And finally, he just couldn't stand it anymore, and he blurted out and asked the master, "Master, how do I enter Zen?" In other words, how do I tap into that place within the peace and stillness that he so apparently saw in his teacher? And so the master said, "Can you hear the mountain stream?" And of course, the student couldn't hear the mountain stream. He was just so busy hearing all the thoughts in his head. And so he stopped and he listened, and he did hear the mountain stream. And so the teacher said, "Enter Zen there." And so they continued on their walking together in nature. And pretty soon, the student just couldn't stand. The thoughts were back 100 miles an hour, even though he had felt such a sense of peace for momentarily. And then then he just couldn't stand it, and he finally said to the master, "What would you have said if I couldn't have heard the mount stream?" And the master said, "Enter Zen there." And so this just points to the fact that wherever we are in this journey of silence, noise in the head, longing and having the questions, or feeling the moments of peace and bliss within, it's really all the perfect place to be. And some people are more oriented towards movement. Some people, it's not natural for them to sit and be silent in that way. Some people love to get up and move. Some people are dancing their prayers these days. And some people are very much oriented towards doing something physical, like hatha yoga. And some love to be out in nature and to feel like they're in a church when they're out in nature. And or just gardening. Maybe that's your way of really feeling the presence of God within yourself in gardening. And another one of the very important things that we can do is to love ourselves unconditionally, right here, right now, in this moment, giving up the eternal self-improvement project, right? That can go on forever. And instead, claiming our divine heritage as these eternal beings of light and love and beauty beyond description. And this is what I love, the music points to that Andoni shared. The meditation, right here, right now, it's in all of us. So we can be on an eternal search, or we can claim it as who we are in this moment. How do we honor the sacred in one another? There's a beautiful word that they use as a greeting in India. Maybe some of you have heard it. It's becoming more known in the West through yoga. And it's an ancient Sanskrit word, namaste. And basically it means, I bow to the divine in you. Isn't that such a beautiful description? Imagine the difference in our relationships with one another and in our communities and in the world if we really did stop, and when we would say hello or namaste, to really see the being before us. We're all moving so fast past each other, but to stop and really see the sacredness of the one before us, that the light of Christ, the Buddha nature, is in their heart right there, no matter how covered over it may seem to be. So if we honor the spiritual dimension of life, the question really does become, how are we honoring that within our relationships? If it's a priority in your life, do you really see it in the fabric of your lives and your relationships with one another, with your families, with your beloved, with your children, with your grandchildren? Those of us who are really called to the Spirit in this way, to the acknowledgement of this presence, how is that being shown in our lives? Once again, because the culture is not pointing in this direction. So for those of us who are waking up to this, how do we really honor it in our relationships? By maybe supporting each other and taking time away to be in silence or to be gardening, to know that our partners and our family members need that time to care for their souls. So, of course, the gift that we can give anyone is the quality of our presence. Whether it's our beloved, whether it's the person at the checkout counter. Can't you tell when somebody really stops and sees you? When you ask them how they are or how are you doing, you can tell when someone really was connected there when they answered you and that they really saw you. And it really makes a difference. We get to see how do we react when somebody pushes our buttons and triggers an old pattern. Can we really step back and take a breath and remember what's really true? And of course there's going to be times when we don't, when we fall back into the old pattern. And can we forgive ourselves Time and time again, can we forgive our loved ones? Time and time again. And however many times it takes. We get to be reminded of our humanness, like right now me taking a drink, you know? My human just that humility of being human, you know? Just that's something we share, the imperfections. And it's so beautiful when we can more and more feel the perfection within the imperfection. That's what's so amazing, you know, is that the perfection is right here, right now, in us, in the midst of us, all around us, in whatever our circumstances. There is a peace that passeth, as Jesus said, is so beautiful, that passeth understanding, and is this peace that isn't dependent upon our life circumstances, what's going on in the challenges of our lives that we all have. We can get our hearts broken on a regular basis, as I know I do, and I'm sure many of you do. I mean, all you have to do is look at what's going on in our country and the world, and how to be with that, you know, perhaps hurting heart, and remember what's true in the midst of it. So, how do we honor the sacred in the world? There's a great story I'd like to share from the Zen Buddhist tradition. And it's a 12th century story about an ox herder. And it basically has to do with illustrations, 10 illustrations of this ox herder. So the illustrations point to the 10 levels of spiritual realization in Zen Buddhism. And these are signposts on the spiritual path. So a man is in search of an ox. And the man, of course, is symbolizing the spiritual student, the initiate, the Zen initiate. And the ox is representing the Buddha nature that he's in search of. So the first illustration is representing the first stage, searching for truth. The second stage is discovering footsteps, which I love. Isn't that just great? Just, you know, he sees the footsteps of the ox now. The third stage is he's perceiving truth. And the fourth stage is that he catches truth. So I won't go into the other stages because they're not really relevant so much to what I want to share now as the 9th and 10th stages. So the 9th stage is returning to source. But the 10th stage is in the world with everything just as it is. And so I love this story because it so beautifully illustrates that when we deeply know who we are, deeply know our true nature, that we can live fully in the world without getting lost in it. So of course we have many great masters who have shown us the way, masters like Jesus and Buddha, who Jesus, for example, of course, was deeply drawn within times in solitude and the desert, and many trials and tribulations before he finally came forward and was recognized as a spiritual master and great teacher. Buddha, of course, was on a very arduous spiritual quest, very many austerities, very difficult time before he reached enlightenment, and then was called to share his teachings with the world. So he was another great example of that. And so, of course, these spiritual masters are role models for each of us. And so they are pointing the way as examples for each of us. And there are many others. There are many, Mother Teresa, you know, there are many, many examples of spiritual masters who have gone within, discovered and deeply connected with the inner gifts, and then felt called to be of service and to bring them forward into the world. So, of course, most of us are not destined to be world teachers. Every one of us has an impact on the world in our own unique way. Every one of us, in ways that we can't imagine. And all of the spiritual teachers tell us that. So we may think our lives are insignificant. Not so. Which is quite amazing to realize that every one of us is a spark of this divine essence. Each one of us really having an important role to play in whatever we do in our lives. Martin Luther King used to like to say, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. So every day here in our community, in our country, and in the world, beautiful souls are sharing their love with the world, making a difference in their own quiet, beautiful way. Nurses, doctors, teachers, mothers and fathers caring for their children, people who've devoted their lives to protecting and defending the earth and the animals, all the creatures of the earth. And so and you won't hear about them on the 7 o'clock news. You know, we don't hear much about the good news in the world, in our news, unfortunately. So with so much suffering and turmoil in the world, each one of us can shine the light of our eternal being into this world and make such a difference. Each and every one of us, everyone here in the room, everyone who will listen to what's been shared here today, each and every one of us makes a difference by the presence of our being. And the more conscious we are of this inner light that we have as a gift to share with the world. And it's so precious when you really know who you are and you know the light within, that you know that that's what everyone is, no matter how covered over it may be. And it's certainly quite covered over in some of us. So I'd like to end now where I began and leave this with you, to take with you into your life, which is, what is sacred to you? And how are you honoring that within yourself, within your relationships, and in the world? Namaste.